Hello and welcome. In this video, we will conduct a case analysis of a significant legal resolution from the Supreme Court of the Philippines. The case is titled ATTY, ROMEO M. ESMERO versus His Excellency, Honorable President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, with the case number GR number 256,288, decided on June 29, 2021. By the end of this analysis, you will be able to: first, identify the key facts and background of the case. Second, determine the central legal issue the Supreme Court had to decide. Third, understand the Supreme Court's ruling and the legal principles it applied. And fourth, explain the ratio decidendi, or the reason for the court's decision. Let's begin by establishing the facts and background of this case. Our first objective is to identify the facts and background of the case. This will give us the context we need to understand the legal arguments. The case was initiated by a lawyer, ATTY, ROMEO M. ESMERO, who filed a petition for mandamus. A writ of mandamus is a court order compelling a government official to perform a duty that is legally required and not subject to their discretion. In other words, it's used to force an official to do something they have no choice but to do. ATTY. ESMERO's petition sought to compel the respondent, President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, to comply with his constitutional duty to defend the national territory, specifically the West Philippine Sea, against Chinese incursions. The petitioner made several key assertions to support his claim. First, he argued that the government has a prime duty to protect the people and their rights, including the national territory. He suggested the president should consider engaging in a defensive war and call upon the people to defend the state. Second, he asserted that the president's public pronouncements and actions on the West Philippine Sea must be exercised within the limits prescribed by the Constitution and are ultimately subject to the power of judicial review. Third, he claimed it was a ministerial duty of the president to defend the national territory, including the West Philippine Sea, as established by the UN Arbitral Tribunal. He argued there was unlawful neglect or inaction by the president. And fourth, he contended that this petition regarding the president's inaction was an exception to the general rule of presidential immunity from suit. So, to recap, the petitioner, ATTY. ESMERO filed a mandamus petition to force President Duterte to take more aggressive action to defend the West Philippine Sea, arguing it was a ministerial duty and that the president's immunity did not apply. Now that we have the facts, let's move to our second objective, identifying the central legal issue. This is the main question the Supreme Court had to answer. The core issue in this case was whether the president's duty to defend the national territory is a ministerial duty that can be compelled by a writ of mandamus. To understand this, we need to clarify the difference between a ministerial duty and a discretionary duty. A ministerial duty is one that an officer performs in a given state of facts, in a prescribed manner, without regard to or the exercise of their own judgment. It's a duty that is clear, certain, and leaves no room for discretion. A discretionary duty, on the other hand, involves the exercise of judgment and choice. The officer has the authority to decide how or whether to perform the act. The petitioner argued that defending the territory was a ministerial duty, meaning the president had no choice but to follow a specific course of action, like going to the UN Security Council or suing China in the International Court of Justice. The Supreme Court, therefore, had to determine if the president's constitutional duty to defend the national territory falls into the category of a ministerial duty, which can be enforced by mandamus, or a discretionary duty, which cannot. Let's now analyze the Supreme Court's ruling and the legal principles it applied to resolve the issue. The Supreme Court unanimously dismissed the petition for utter lack of merit. The court provided two main reasons for its decision. The first was based on the principle of presidential immunity from suit. The court cited its previous ruling in De Lima versus Duterte, which clearly established that the president is immune from suit during their incumbency, regardless of the nature of the suit filed against them. Since the petitioner named President Duterte as the sole respondent, the case had to be dismissed outright. This means that even if the petitioner had a valid claim, the president cannot be sued while in office. This principle ensures the president can perform their duties without the constant threat of litigation. The court then proceeded to address the core issue, even if, for the sake of argument, they were to overlook the immunity flaw. This leads us to the second and more substantive reason for the dismissal. The court ruled that the president's duty to defend the national territory is a discretionary duty, not a ministerial one. it falls under the President's exclusive power to conduct foreign affairs. The court emphasized that the President is the sole organ and authority in the external affairs of the country. This means the President has the exclusive power to conduct and manage the country's interface with other states and governments. The court acknowledged that this power is not absolute and must be exercised within the context and parameters set by the Constitution and existing laws. However, it stressed that the decision of how best to address disputes with other nations, whether militarily, diplomatically, or legally, rests on the political branches of government, not the judiciary. In summary, the court applied two key principles: presidential immunity, which barred the suit from the start, and the discretionary nature of the President's foreign affairs power, which meant the duty to defend the territory could not be compelled by mandamus. Finally, let's discuss the ratio decidendi, which is the legal principle or rule on which the court's decision is based. It's the reason for the ruling. The ratio decidendi of this case is that the President's constitutional duty to defend the national territory is a discretionary power, not a ministerial one, and therefore cannot be compelled by a writ of mandamus. The court's reasoning is rooted in the separation of powers. It recognized that the President, as the head of state and the chief architect of foreign policy, must have the discretion to choose the most effective and appropriate course of action in dealing with international disputes. The court explicitly stated that it cannot substitute its exercise of discretion for the President's, especially in matters of national security and foreign relations, where the executive branch has the most information and expertise. The court also noted that the Philippines had already pursued a legal remedy by filing a case against China under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which resulted in an arbitral award overwhelmingly in favor of the Philippines. The fact that the current President chose a different approach did not mean he had unlawfully abdicated his duty. Therefore, the court concluded that the petitioner failed to show a clear legal right to the performance of a ministerial act, which is a fundamental requirement for a mandamus petition to succeed. In essence, the court affirmed the President's broad authority in foreign affairs and national security, emphasizing that the judiciary should not interfere with the executive's policy decisions in these areas, unless there is a clear violation of law or grave abuse of discretion. Let's quickly recap what we've learned from this case analysis. First, the facts involved a petition for mandamus to compel the President to defend the West Philippine Sea. Second, the central issue was whether this duty was ministerial or discretionary. Third, the court ruled it was discretionary, citing presidential immunity and the President's foreign affairs power. And fourth, the ratio decidendi was that the President's duty to defend the territory is a discretionary power, not a ministerial one, and thus cannot be compelled by mandamus. This case is a powerful illustration of the principle of separation of powers in action, particularly the deference the judiciary shows to the executive branch in matters of foreign policy and national security. Thank you for watching this case analysis. I hope it has helped you understand the key legal concepts involved.